Hello, all, and welcome to Essence of Wonder. We have had some technical difficulties today, but I'm sure you'll forgive us if you even noticed them, which I hope you didn't. But now you know about them. I made it worse, Karen. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you, Gadi?
I am. Are you excited, Karen? No, I'm excited this time. This show. So, if we go back some months back, we had a show about Strategy Strikes Back, which is a book about strategy, public policy, leadership, but from the eyes of Star Wars. From the perspective of let's talk about Star Wars when we talk about these things. And it was just so much fun for me. One of my fandoms, and I believe yours as well, Karen, is strategy. Although we practice them in very different places.
I wouldn't have put it that way, but yes.
How would you have put it?
It's more of a problem that follows me through other fandoms.
Interesting. If you asked me what my hobbies were, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I probably would have said science fiction, reading, dancing, stuff like that. And then a few years ago, I decided, no, my actual hobbies are what I keep bringing back with me. Self-development, communication with others, strategy, modeling, and understanding how things work and systems work and making them repeatable. These are truly the things that keep coming to life. So I appreciate that.
I think of a group that I know that does a lot of both running and drinking. Like their thing is that they're called hashers, and they run something like 15 miles, but from bar to bar to bar, drinking the whole way. And they, instead of calling themselves a running club with a drinking problem, they call themselves a drinking club with a running problem.
As I always say, it's 8 a.m. somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think it is more of a strategy problem.
But I didn't want to go into this, but defining what strategy is probably the biggest question in strategy. And there are many ways to go, not even going into what's the difference between tactics and strategy. When it comes down to it, I'll share a story. And then we'll start talking to our nice friends that are joining us today. I'm so excited. So something like, I really am. Something like, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, I encountered a book. It was called, Today We're Here to Talk About To Boldly Go, which is a new upcoming book. But now I'm going to talk about another book. It's called Against the Gods. And as you go and look at that book, there is a Rembrandt of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. And you see this ship and how these people are trying to survive on the, Sea of Galilee, which really shouldn't have any storms, to be honest. And it's really small. And you can see how human nature is trying to win against nature. And it's so beautiful. I had to start reading it, and then I discovered it's actually a history of risk. And I'm like, what? And I only read the introduction or the first chapter because in it, they say that there are many definitions about what the modern quote-unquote man means, Michelangelo or Machiavelli or whatever. And they say it's about technology, it's about a lot of different things. This book claimed it was about taking risks, risk management. And I was like, what? No way. I want it to be true, but it can't be true. So I shut the book down. Shut it off. And over the years, I started reading Homer all of a sudden, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And I noticed that everybody there at Veer 2, the fates have decided what we're going to do with our lives, and it's done. Therefore, we're going to go all the way, and we're going to battle. We're going in screaming and not caring about anything just to show our Veer 2, and people remember our glory. And later on, I encountered Machiavelli, where it became more about showing that we're thinking about this and can try and control our fate. Because when it comes down to it, everything is chaos, everything is luck. But strategy is the only thing that actually stands between us and that. It's trying to affect that. My take. And therefore, when we're doing the show about Star Wars strategy, and they mentioned they're doing this new book to boldly go about, let's talk about strategy, let's talk about leadership, let's talk about modern conflict, but from a sci-fi perspective in general, I'm like, let's do a show! and just to show how excited I am, and then we'll move on. One of the chapters, every chapter there, I just table of contents, I stayed on that for 15 minutes. And one of the chapters is called, I know I geeked out to you about that already. You're not Ender Wiggins, and that's okay. I couldn't breathe. Like my imposter syndrome was shouting at me, I can still do this. I was so excited. Anyway, let's bring on Steve and talk to him a little bit. For some reason, my setup is not very stable. I'm not happy about that. We'll try to fix it as we go. Steve, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me, Gadi.
You're amazing, and thank you for doing the show with us, truly.
Thanks for having us. I mean, this means a lot to all of us, but it's always good to see the two of you and to be able to plug back in and spend some time with you.
let's talk about you. I broke down your bio into a couple of lines here. So you're an award-winning faculty member of the University of Kansas, right? And you chair the graduate program in organizational leadership and in supply chain management.
Yep.
You are also a former senior military strategist. Well, that's why you're here, right?
That's why
And
I'm
you're
here.
actually the creative force behind the defense microblog, right? Doctrine Man, with 3 question marks, I believe, or 2 question marks. And you've been a career writer. You speak you passionately. You care about mentoring other people. You're a senior fellow at the Modern War Institute at West Point. You're a co-founder of national security blog, Divergent Options. You've done so much stuff. I'm just going to stop here for a second, but I'll say that you have numerous books, not just this one, right?
Right.
And you're essentially, let's say, somebody I like, which doesn't happen too often.
Thank you.
So with that in mind, I would just like to have you spend a minute with us, just say why this book?
So you mentioned in the lead up, you talked about our discussion of Strategy Strikes Back. And I think you're going to find that, Max and Mick and I were involved in that. Jon was involved in Winning Westeros with us. Personally, I felt like there was a little bit more to be told. I thought we did really well with Strategy Strikes Back and with Winning Westeros, but I felt like that there was just a little bit more to tell, a little bit more to work with. And about 2018, I think, Mick and I were having dinner at West Point, sitting at the table, and Mick threw out the idea of doing this. So just broadly looking at science fiction, not restricting us to 1 or 2 universes, but just opening the aperture so we could get into any kind of universe, any discussion of science fiction broadly, and it just kind of ballooned from there. And then I brought Jon in, since Jon and I have known each other for almost 20 years as a co-editor, and then we just built this. And of course, here it is now. It took about a good 3 years to bring this whole thing to fruition, but it's a labor of love, and to be able to do it with so many of the original team that worked the other 2 books, it's just been a godsend. Because when you approach people and say, hey, here's the idea, they already know exactly where they're going to go and what we're going to do. And by opening that aperture, you see, like what you said about Ender Wiggin. I mean, we couldn't talk about Ender Wiggin in the other books, but we can talk about Ender Wiggin here. We couldn't talk about Babylon 5. We couldn't talk about The Expanse. We didn't really get a chance to talk Star Trek, and I'm a big Star Trek fan, always have been. And so being able to bring all that in, it gives you so much source material for people to draw from. And then for the fans, because there are fans that really want to read about, hey, explain to me, the role of gender in Star Wars, even though we've talked a little bit about it, really dig in. Or to let's talk about Planet of the Apes, or let's talk about the Wrath of Khan, or any of these kinds of things. It just blew up into a book. And we could have written 2 or 3 books off the ideas. And every time
you could and you would, sir. You could and you would.
Go ahead.
No, I said you could and you would.
Oh, absolutely. It's just every time somebody reads something about this, they said, hey, I had an idea too. I wish I could have been part of this team. Tell me the next time. Because people relate well to this. And the use of fictional intelligence as source material is it's an endless reservoir of fun.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before, I believe, when on other shows, but the idea of using these fictional worlds as the source material to talk about these ideas is great, because they're in many ways they are flatter than the real wars and situations that people have many perspectives on. And there are, events that happen in real life get covered by thousands of angles. And
right.
These worlds kind of often exist in one series written by one author or one piece of material. And so they're both simpler and widely known and understood. And we just sort of share an understanding of them much more than
absolutely
conflicts.
All right. So let's bring in the rest of our guests and get started. We have a little bit of introductions to do here, and then we'll just start arguing with each other. I asked everybody in advance to accommodate my Israeli and cut people off and shout at each other, kind of like argument clinic from Monty Python, just because I truly want to have fun here, because I am here too. Okay, so I want to introduce everybody. First of all, I want to introduce Mick, who asked me to invent a bio for him. So I will still respect him enough to read his actual bio, if that's okay with everybody. But, well, you know. So Mick is a major general in the Australian Army. He's a combat engineering officer, and he's commanded tactical units at the troop, squadron, regiment, task force, and the brigade level. He is a veteran of East Timor, Iran, and Afghanistan. He served in the Pakistan-Afghanistan Coordination Cell in the U.S. Joint Staff. He's a writer. He's a passionate advocate of professional education. He's doing lifelong learning, and he's an Australian. So it's going to get interesting here, because Australians usually are funny, unlike Israelis. And then we have...
Well, at least we think we are, Gary.
Well, I think I'm funny, and I still make jokes, but they're never funny. We have Jonathan, right? Klug, who is a U.S. Army strategist. He serves as an assistant professor at the Department of Strategy, Planning, and Operations in the U.S. Army War College. Is commissioned as an armor officer, who served in Haiti, Bosnia, South Korea, Egypt, and Iraq. And he's working on his PhD right now in naval and military history from the University of New Brunswick. And then we have Max. You know Max, because I made fun of Max last time, because he made fun of me, because never mind. And he's an author, he's a public speaker. He has wonderful books like World War Z, or Z. We have Canadians here, or is it the other way around? Never mind. And we have the Harlem Hellfighter. He has the Harlem Hellfighters book. He has Devolution. And he's also a senior fellow in the Modern War Institute at West Point. And he's a senior resident fellow at the Atlantic Council Art of Future Warfare project. Hey, Max. Hey, everybody. Hey, John. Hey, Steve. Hey, Mick. So just to get us started, I think that Steve asked you several questions. And which question do you think you want to start with, Steve? Because I can't wait to get started on my own. So I'll let you go first.
I usually hit people with a softball question first.
That's because you're nice. Let's start something that's not...
So let's start with Max, because Max's chapter, I think I read probably more than any other chapter in the book, mostly because he was the one that didn't make mistakes, and I didn't want to read the chapters that had mistakes in them. They did wear you out. But I understand now why Max wrote what he did, and it was brilliant in the sense that, you know, you talk about teasing out what you're really working on and what you're really thinking about. But I think for the audience, it would be good to understand what he wrote about and what the motivation for that was.
Thank you. I wrote a chapter on not a Star Trek book, but a Star Trek movie, Star Trek Nemesis, specifically talking about the Romulans and the Remans and what we can learn from that, because the Remans were sort of the underclass of the Romulan Empire, and they did all the Romulans' dirty work. Specifically in the Dominion War, they were shock troops and did the hardest fighting and won the biggest victories. But then they came home after the war to the exact same underclass position, and they were not rewarded for their blood. And so that started a Reman rebellion, which then almost brought down the Romulan Empire. And I thought, what can we learn from that? Well, it's very simple. That great powers that use either colonial troops or marginalized communities in their armed forces during war better be prepared to reward those communities in peace. Otherwise, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And we see the historical parallels, especially as Americans, because we've been both Romulans and Remans. When we were the Remans, when we were the British Empire's war horses, and we fought damn hard for them in the French and Indian War, and all we wanted was a seat at the table. We didn't want independence. Independence was the last resort. We didn't mind fighting for the empire. We didn't even mind paying heavier taxes to fund the wars. We just wanted a seat in Parliament, and that was it. George Washington's greatest life's goal was to be a British serving officer and wear the pretty red coat. And of course, you know, the British, which is unusual for them, could be arrogant, exclusive dicks and basically say, "Oh no, little colonial, you go sit over there. You'll never be one of us." And to which then we said, "Well, then screw you. If you don't let us in the house, we're going to build our own house." And we learned that lesson. So much so that we actually tried to reverse it because we had our own remans within our new house called America, specifically African American soldiers. And we knew that if we let African Americans fight alongside white troops and win glory on the battlefield, they were going to come home from war and demand to be treated as equals. So you see, at least in the early part of the American experiment, a concerted effort from the very top to try and keep black troops out of combat. And that sort of reached a critical point in World War I. That's why I wrote about the Harlem Hellfighters. Black troops were consistently sabotaged, tried to be manual laborers, but they got in the fight anyway, and specifically the Harlem Hellfighters came home as one of the most decorated units in the entire U.S. Army. So then you see a shift in America's policy in the Second World War, after the Second World War, where we realize if we are going to step out onto the world stage as a great power based just on ideals, we better damn well be prepared to live up to them. And so you see exclusivity become inclusivity, to the point that the United States military has actually led the rest of the country as a force for inclusion, giving women jobs before they could even vote, integrating the armed forces before the rest of the country was integrated, coming home from these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's not a coincidence that now Americans get to marry legally who they love. That is the lessons that we learned, which is if the Remans are going to fight for you, they better damn well be equal to the Romulans.
I, for one, accept our new robotic overlords. I just wonder when they'll get here.
So that's actually, Max's was one of 2 or 3 chapters that really struck a very subtle chord that I think these are the kinds of things that I think that when people read the book, that they're going to pull more out of it than they may realize, because there's these little things that, and they're not little per se, but they're very subtle and nuanced. The arguments are. And it took me, I'll be honest, it took me 2 or 3 readings of Max's chapter before the light came on. And it wasn't just a deluge of 30-some chapters all at once to go through. It was reading it and then, drawing some thoughts and conclusions and really what you want to do. And what I think we did remarkably well with this book is you present arguments that make people debate what's inside those chapters, which are really broader social issues that we're dealing with in a contemporary sense. So you also, like I talked about the role of gender. So when you read the chapter of X-wings and Y-wings, it really is about the role of women in the Star Wars universe, the evolving role of women, and how they lead, and how as a gender they're treated, how as a gender they grow and develop. But it's very nuanced and subtle, and the title was absolutely genius. You wouldn't necessarily catch that. And Kira Rolson, who wrote that chapter, she wouldn't tell anybody up until about a week ago exactly what she was getting at. So it leaves it for you to figure out on your own, which is the beauty of something like this.
All right. So just a quick note here. This is a technical issue. John, there is some background noise from your area, so when you don't speak, if you can mute your own microphone, that would be great. Awesome. So going right back in. What other questions have you got for us, Steve?
Well, I'd really like to get with Mick on this one, because we threw this idea around quite a bit, but it was Mick at that dinner sitting, I think we were in the Thayer Hotel, and you threw this out there, and neither one of us had the time to work this solely, or even as the two of us, which made an anthology a perfect project, because both of us are knee deep in our own worlds, as is Max, as is John. Finding the time is tough. You have to carve it out of something else, and eventually you get to a point where you're carving bone, and that doesn't suit anybody. But Mick, you really were the one to foster this idea. Tell us about the core idea, where it came from, what you were aiming for, and if we hit the target or not.
I think that the original idea came out just because, as I say in the forward, science fiction is my comfort food, and why not use comfort food to provide a more accessible medium for the next couple of generations of our military and national security thinkers and leaders to think about some of the challenges we have ahead. And science fiction, for me, provides an amazing backdrop to do that. It allows you to think about the future without threatening current rice bowls. It allows you to fail safely. But I think too, and this is the most important reason for me, and I run a course here at the Australian Defence College that uses science fiction, is it allows people in what is a very hierarchical and strata-obsessed organisation, i.e. the military, to be more creative. And it's not always something that we rate highly in military institutions, but we should. Tactical innovation and creativity is generally prized, but the higher up you go, it's not as incentivized as much as it should. So for me, this book and for people to write and have a voice publicly is all about allowing people to be creative about strategy, policy, and the future of our institutions, and indeed our countries.
Oh, that's just good. And Gaddy, if I get one more question, I'm going to hit Jon.
He's Canadian. Let's skip him.
Let's skip him. No way. You cannot skip. You cannot skip the strategy troll. Otherwise, he'll troll you. Jon, our chapter, and we bandied about this chapter quite a bit. And granted, we probably picked the most obvious villain in the entire Star Trek universe, the most well-known battle. But we focused on the Battle of the Matara Nebula. We focused on some very specific things. But and we could talk about that all day long. But I want Jon to talk about how this plays out in the real world rather than just the Star Trek universe. Talk about what the chapter was about, and then how that relates to us in the real world.
Yeah, just to say for a second, when Steve asked me about doing this, I emphatically was behind it. I mean, the entire book really taps into imagination, using imagination to envision a potential future. And as Mick alluded to, we can learn so much from that. And to tie in the Battle of the Matara Nebula, it's about genius on one side, but experience on the other. And that's what we really tried to tap into there. And you see this in the battle where, Khan's obviously superhuman in so many ways. We won't talk about megalomania and toxic leadership just yet, but, just absolutely gifted. But it's the experience of Kirk, the practical experience of leadership and years in amongst the stars. But he also has Spock. That's a team of two, but it's also a larger team. It's the entire crew that we all know and love so well. I'm an old Star Trek person. I won't go down that road if people want to cast stones for comparing crews. But anyway, it's that experience, and you have to have a team to tap into all the creativity and experience and bring it together. Where Khan provides you a perfect example of what not to do, relying on one person to attempt to drive everything. And he had gotten to the point, if you look at his whole story arc, and that's one of the other chapters we did, he won't listen to anyone else. He won't take anyone else's recommendations. It's all on him, and it's no surprise where he ends up. So I hope that addressed that, Steve.
Oh yeah, and I think where we also kind of get is that's something that we deal with in our day-to-day lives. I see it in my second career often. I work with some amazingly brilliant people that they have never set foot outside of a school, and brilliant people, but they can't fill their own car with gas. And it's like but I will say for those people, there's a huge appreciation for the experiential factor that we bring. and that's why I'm where I'm at, is the experience factor. But we all understand that timeless struggle between the smartest person in the room and the person who's actually got the experience and wherewithal to make things happen, and that's something that everybody can relate to, not just military people, which we saw that a lot in the military, but in the real world too, out in the civilian sector, we all deal with that. And it made for a fun chapter to write, and then to be able to weave in the great naval battle in space was that's just icing on the cake. And Jon's a naval historian, so he really enjoys that. So we got to have fun with that.
It's kind of the journey. I keep running into this in everything I do, both within myself and without. It's the constant balance or battle, depending on how you want to look at it, between Dunning-Kruger effect and imposter syndrome. And I mean, strategists usually use more the fox and hedgehog analogy, I suppose. So we can look at Kirk and Spock or Kirk and Picard. Max, I can see you moving in your chair. All you.
No. When we talk about emerging threats, the idea of Khan not listening to people, I keep coming back to the threat of the Borg. And I keep coming back to the idea that Q, at the end of the Q episode, when we're first introduced to the Borg, Picard sees the silver lining and says, well, maybe we just got woken up to an emerging threat. And
one of the moments, I'm going to cut you right off here because I'll tell you that I love you. Because in that same episode, don't forget what you want to say. Don't forget what you want to say. And in the same episode, or I think it was the same episode, what I liked about TNG was it kept defying my expectations of what will happen next. Yeah. You're a writer, far more than me. I write for the hobby. I'm never going to try to even get published. And there is this saying of it needs to be surprising but unexpected, right? Or something of the sort. So this is with Steel. When it happens, I can say, "Oh, I understand how this happened. It makes sense for me, but I'm still surprised." And what happened there in TNG is nearly twice or three times every season. I'll be like, "How did that happen?" And it still makes sense. And in that episode, it was Picard not saying, "Fuck you, Q. We are humans and we don't need you." But he gets on his knees and says, "If you need me to say I need you, I need you."
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, this is exactly, for me, that episode's so important because this is sort of the core of I've given so many talks at West Point, and also literally I was just doing a virtual conversation at the Air Force Academy yesterday, and I was talking about the myth of failure of imagination, because we hear that a lot. Every time America gets sucker punched, and nobody gets sucker punched like America, we always seem to cling to the narrative that we couldn't see it coming, that we were totally surprised. And that's an absolute myth. Because every time we get sucker punched, and every time everyone says, "Oh God, we never could have imagined it," bull crap. There was always a report written, there was always somebody ringing the bell. So it's not that the ideas aren't there, it's that they're not being listened to.
Steve, who wrote the chapter in the previous book about the Star Wars strategy? By the way, I got Max's permission to keep cutting him off. He'll cut me off back.
We talked about
I know. We talked about it in the past. Steve, in the previous book, there was somebody who wrote about the communication and relationship between intelligence and the civilian leadership. And the example given was Admiral, what's his name? I can't believe the Grand Moff Tarkin. And the intelligence comes in and says, "Look, this is going to happen." He says, "No."
Right. Evacuate? A moment of truth.
We have analyzed their attack, something like that, right?
I think you overestimate their chances.
Don't ask me who wrote that chapter, because I had to go all the way to the other side of the room and tackle Rocket to get to the book. And
it's one of the first 5. I can promise you that.
Yeah, that's. I read books from the back to the front for the most part, so that's not really helpful for me. But I do remember that chapter. I just don't remember who wrote it off the top of my head.
But
I know it wasn't me.
Just this entire conversation will be Max talking and us interrupting him. Go ahead, Max.
Yeah, I just want to say something real quick, if I could, to jump on to Max's point. In 1925, a gentleman named Hector Bywater, a journalist and naval commentator, wrote a book on a war between the United States and Japan, from 1931 to 1933. So I just wanted to throw that out there as a perfect exemplar of the fact that imagination this gentleman saw it and went into the details. It was very Tom Clancy-like in his ability to capture what reality turned out to be. Well, it was very close, I'll say that.
Billy Mitchell, General Billy Mitchell, put himself on trial during his court-martial, and he talked about that Japan would one day attack our naval base at Pearl Harbor. He didn't envision aircraft carriers, he envisioned heavy bombers, but still an air attack across the Pacific at our naval base in Pearl Harbor, ringing the bell in the 1920s. No failure of imagination there.
It kind of seems to me like strategists in general, and being in cybersecurity, ars poetics, I suffer a lot from this, but we are kind of the Cassandras of the world. And as we study the history of strategists, there was the guy in France, I forget right now, before with the tank. Maybe one of you military historians will remember who it was that kept saying, the Germans are going to come at us with tanks, and we got to be prepared. Or I can give endless examples. Are we actually Cassandras? Do we see these things coming? Are we being ignored consistently? Is there something we can do differently? Let's start with Mick.
Well, I think it's about cutting through the noise. I agree with Max. There's no such thing as absolute bolts from the blue. I mean, Roberta Woolsetter's classic book looked at, surprise. I love going back to the pre-World War I era. It was a very fertile period for fiction, science fiction. It's when military science fiction was born, because like at the moment, it was a time of amazing technological disruption. Planes, radios, cars, mass manufacturing. Over 400 science fiction books were written in the lead up to World War I across Germany, France, the UK, the US. And these weren't strategists, these were just authors who were trying to deal with the societal and technological disruption they were seeing around them and trying to make it accessible to people who thought it was just impossible to deal with the pace of change. Kind of sounds like the era we're in at the moment, I think. So, we can, it's not about predicting, it's about sorting through all the changes that are going on and what are the likely trajectories. People have tread this path before, and I think this book, the people on this podcast, the authors and many others are just trying to use fiction and science fiction as the mechanism to make change accessible and humanize change to a lot of people in our society that are feeling quite bewildered at what's going on.
Jon, you're studying military history. Do you see science fiction in a way as written in many cases the same way, but as the history of the future? Or is it just fiction of telling a story?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, we look back at history as our only real laboratory. I mean, it's the only way that military officers can look at problems, but I think there's been a bit of a renaissance and people are accepting science fiction is now also being able to fulfill that role. There's certain concreteness to looking at history, but being able to tap into the imagination, like I mentioned before, with science fiction, it can force you to view things from different perspectives in a way that history, I don't think, can. I don't know if that makes as much sense as I would hope it would, but it just allows you to tap into the creative side and to ignore some of the realm of the possible, right? So if you can jump forward 10 or 20 years, you can start to divest some of the initial challenges that are always brought up. Well, how much is this going to cost? Those kinds of points. And that weapon system will never, exist. Well, what if it did? And we look back and Mick and Max have already mentioned this. Some of the things that were looked at as impossible at one point, you only go 10 years and suddenly that's a real capability. So we need to explore these things. So I think the two things together, history and using science fiction, can be very, very powerful. And I know that we're not the only ones, but just speaking from personal experience, the Army War College, we examine both.
Steve, I think you wanted to.
Now I get to interrupt you, Gaddy.
Yeah.
We've come a long ways, because I think both Mick and I recognize that you dial the clock back 30 years, 40 years, you would have never found a science fiction book, or even much in terms of fiction other than Once an Eagle, on a reading list. And now more and more you see professional reading lists that are leaning into science fiction and the fictional thriller realm in general, because of that very thing. You want leaders who have that imagination and who can think a little differently, and that's how you get it. It's not just the grounding in history, which is wonderful, but it's opening up the mind to the possibilities of what's out there, and that's where we're seeing that real renaissance take root. Mick, you see the same thing down there? I mean, down there. I know you're not down there and you're not upside down. The toilets don't flush backwards necessarily. Maybe they do, but
lies, fake news.
No, it's all true. But Steve's dead right. We have seen this renaissance in acceptance by senior leaders that actually fiction is not a bad thing to help develop the minds of our leaders and future leaders. I think Starship Troopers kind of led the way there. I mean, it's not my favourite book for a few reasons, but I think even before that, we saw in the 50s and 60s and 70s the dystopian genre, where people were thinking about nuclear war and its impacts, through to Tom Clancy's Red Storm Rising, The Day After in the early 1980s. It's a bit of it actually set in Steve's hometown. There's been an acceptance in society that we can use these means to think about the future. It's our senior military leaders have come to it more recently. That's a good thing, but it also shows that we don't always lead society. Sometimes we're following. We need to be better than that.
I want to jump on. Mick had a point last time, which I don't want us to lose this, because I think it's way too critical, which is fiction also gives people a psychological and emotional out. So that way you can read it, and you can, if you want it just to be light entertainment, you can. If you want to go deeper, you can. It's the psychological condom, if you will, that gets around people's fears. It's the way to talk about a real pandemic, but put it in a zombie apocalypse.
Yep.
It's a way to talk about preparing for nuclear war, but it's alien invasion. Because people do have an ego defense mechanism. And if you make something too real, then it will trip the wires and people will want to tune out. But if you just give them the veneer of fiction, it allows people to take that first step and go just a little bit deeper and start to think.
I'll actually jump on that, Max, and say that a thing that I've always liked about the speculative genres in particular is that you can often get people to, step away from their immediate prejudices and their reactions to the real groups and people around them, and listen to and think about a pattern of the reality of that group, and then think, oh wait, is this a real life, how can I apply this to groups or situations I haven't considered the other side of in my real life.
I think that the thing I've loved about science fiction too, that it's not about the cool tech. I mean, that's just a veneer. It asks the important questions that we in the military sometimes don't but should ask. I mean, what are the ethics of using nuclear weapons? Was part of the dystopian genre of the 50s, 60s and 70s. At the moment, it's what are the ethics of AI, of biological enhancement of human beings. It's done in a safe way, but these are important questions that aren't asked when we're talking to big defence contractors. The question is, can you? We as leaders should be asking, should we do these things? Because some of them there's no turning back from, and we can't. It's like social media. You can't put that genie back in the bottle, but there are some really toxic, awful things about it that we might have liked to have walked into with our eyes open. And I think science fiction allows us to walk into future issues of great import with our eyes more open than they have been in the past.
And I love it when it collapses, when you found out that you took a stance that was opposite than your own, and then wait, what I'm actually thinking. John, then Steve.
Yeah, I was going to mention earlier a couple things. One, we've talked about history, we've talked about science fiction. One of the other things that's, I think, becoming more accepted again, and it has proved its value in the past, but is being explored a lot, is wargaming. So I'll just kind of table that just to mention, to kind of complete that thought. But to go back to what I think Max was saying, and Mick, science fiction, one of the major questions is always, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah.
And in so many of these chapters, you can see that major theme, and then we explore different things, whether it's leadership or conflict or strategy. But maybe this goes back to something you said earlier, Gotti, which is back to that Star Trek allusion. It always maintained the suspension of disbelief, right? So it meant so much. It carried so much value because you still could accept it. And those are some of the best stories, I think, when you can maintain that suspension of disbelief. They did that so remarkably well within that milieu, communicating a very deep point and never lost anybody. And we've all seen shows where where that hasn't happened, where they've gone too far, and then you lose everyone. But that never would happen with the first crew. But anyway.
I'm just going to jump in for a second and say that I think that's so critical, the difference between tech and humanity, because I think that as audience members, as readers, there's aliens and they're attacking. We got to get out of here. And the dudes goes, no, wait, I must go rescue the girl that I just met at the party and talked to for 20 minutes. What?
Oh, you're bagging out one of my favorite movies there, Max.
I'm not going to say who and what. But
I am in this quote and I don't like it.
Oh, God.
Steve,
It wouldn't have been a movie then.
Exactly. Well, but that's why your premise has to be psychologically valid. It has to be the ghost of Hamlet's father saying, hey, I didn't die peacefully. Your uncle killed me. Get him. And Hamlet goes, yeah, because we would all do that. But how many of us here on this panel would honestly risk your life to go rescue someone you just met at a party and talked to for 20 minutes?
That depends. Am I on duty?
Yeah, well, maybe, okay, Gotti would do that. Gotti would say, no. I've got to go rescue her. We just talked. A woman has never
In the movie,
before.
when somebody
This is
jumps
worth my
into
life.
rescue, I would be the one who jumps into rescue her and gets run by a truck, and then the professionals will come in, and actually rescue them.
Although there is something to be said for the concept of everyone matters, whether you know them or not. So there's...
Yeah, but there were other people in between him and her. Like, this was a bit of a
everybody, let's
targeted extraction.
Like
I think that...
go ahead.
I think the issue of humanizing is really important, though. And one of the trends I've seen in the last decade or so, well, not just the last decade, but probably since the end of the Vietnam War, is there's been more veterans that are also writing science fiction. There's been some. Kurt Vonnegut was obviously a veteran, but you've seen more veterans since Vietnam writing science fiction. I mean, Haldeman's The Forever War is a classic and one of my favorites. But even in the last decade, you're seeing the Keira Rolsons, the Michael Mamets, Shane Greaves, and others who are writing, and they bring with them this deep inside knowledge of how soldiers or service people think. And it's really interesting. I mean, The Forever War is a classic, not because it's science fiction, but it's the journey of a returning soldier and his difficulties in coming to grips with the society. And he's having to return to a different society every time he comes back from a mission.
One of my favorite scenes from any sci-fi ever is in The Forever War, where he comes back to a world where everybody is gay for population control, and therefore he is now. He said, "I hated my CO2, right? But at least I wasn't a pervert because he is heterosexual." And actually, Joe shared with us that. One of the things he did in his book was introduce the gay character in order to explore his relationship with a gay friend, because back then, the only relationship you could have with a gay friend is a gay sexual relationship. So he put so much into that book. One of the things he said about this, though, was that he was not a soldier, he was a draftee. He made a big deal out of that.
Yeah, but the experience of returning to your society is the same. And I mean, it's not a new thing. I'm sure there were Roman centurions coming home who felt exactly the same. I mean, this humanizes the stories, as Max said, but I've just found it interesting the last couple of decades, you're seeing more veterans and military people really jumping in and wanting to tell their side of the story. It just adds something additional to the genre. It doesn't devalue other stories at all. It just adds something additional to the genre, I think.
It was, I think, in the last.
Gotti, I got to throw something in there and hearing Mick.
Actually, you and I will both shut up for a second. Steve, you wanted to say
No.
something?
You guys keep going. You're doing great. I'm just
Max.
listening.
I got to say that what fiction can also do, and this is very important for people who work in national security, is to actually illustrate how the threat would play out. Because it's very different doing it. I literally was just talking to someone from NORAD yesterday saying, listen, we have these threats. We know them. They're real. No one's doing anything about it. And for some reason, the PowerPoint presentation that we're giving to the policymakers is not landing. And I said, you got to go over their head. Like,
Okay. We are going to open this up a discussion right now. I created. I'll start this off. Okay, let's do this. I created this entire presentation. I call my presentation of frustration.
Yeah.
Where essentially I call the presentation "Away with Cassandra: The Long Tail of New Technology Waves," and it's not about my presentation, but rather there is a guy from the UK who wrote. We all know the whole idea of the unknown unknowns and all of that stuff, right? We heard about it before. So this guy from the UK kind of mapped it out to elephants and other things, and he goes through known knowns, known unknowns, and known unknown unknowns and unknown knowns, right? And the idea becomes, even if we know something, to what degree do we know about it? So I go back to cybersecurity. We've spoken about three things I want to wire together right now. Before every new wave of technology, which is what I'm going to concentrate on for a minute, whether it's naval warfare, whether it's aerial warfare, whether it's cyber warfare right now, which I got to live through, people go in, and there are two waves. These are waves, these are lines, sorry, where we discuss those. One is in theory, right? So in aerial warfare, you have this type of engagement, and maneuverability is like this, and concentration of force looks like that. Therefore, in cybersecurity, because of the ephemeral nature of blah, 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 it should look like that. At the same time, you get fiction books, which explore that. Same thing with tanks. Whenever there is new technology coming in, so what I've done is I try to look at all these parameters people compare and put them into one list and try to understand, can I show by what happened before with previous waves, what might happen, this is deduction versus induction, so it doesn't necessarily work, what might happen in the next wave. And no matter what I do, I cannot convince people. So I started changing from, let's try to convince people that cybernetic devices are going to be hacked and they have endless bugs in their code, and they are already not just on some random protocol, but rather on wireless, like pacemakers. Let's not convince them this is going to happen, but rather let's try and give it up by now. Because let's try and look at the wider world. There are many risks. These are decision makers. So if I look, and I'll finish with this, it's cyber in the 90s. I was going, why are people not listening to us? This is critical. If we're not going to do something, this is going to happen, and this is going to happen, and that is going to happen. And yet they didn't. But when I look at all the risks they had to deal with, and the budget they had, and the focus they needed to put in, I understand why they didn't. So this is a much wider problem, trying to convince people to do something being Cassandra. And with that, let's get it.
This is where I got to jump in, because this is why fiction is so important for us specifically, because we are citizens of a democracy, right? We can't pretend that we all work for the PLA. People like that, they can only convince this narrow group of people above them because they're the boss. But in a democratic system, our boss is the American voter. So forget about the PowerPoint. Forget about convincing the people in front of you. Jump over their heads and go directly to the American voter. Because I would argue one of the most important papers on arms control was not some presentation to the Defense Department. It was the movie On the Beach, where you actually saw what happened in a safe country, a country that wasn't even nuked, where that slow death creeping in. I mean, my God, I'm going to butcher the accent, Mick. I'm so sorry. But the moment when they're literally on the beach and they're having a great time, and they first talk about the suicide pills, and your heart stops when Anthony Perkins says, I've heard they've got them already in Port Moresby and Darwin. It's already starting.
Yeah.
That terrified populations where, God, there is no hope. And the only hope to win a nuclear war is don't drop the goddamn bombs. That's how you've got to do it for emerging threats to be a Cassandra. Is forget about your boss in the Department of No. Go over their head to the American or Australian or Israeli or Canadian voter / taxpayer.
And scare them?
Damn right.
Yeah. Well, who remembers the day after when it came out? I mean, I remember watching that as a kid.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it it fascinated and horrified multiple generations in the early 1980s, and went, wow, this has made something that was entirely conceptual so real, and it's focused on a little town that wasn't, in the center of things. This impacts everyone. Doesn't matter where you are. Everyone needs to have a vote on this.
Yeah, made duck and cover real.
That
Steve and
last,
John.
oh my God, that last
to get to Gotti
blowing over Melbourne. Oh my God, that's more than 1,000 reports.
That's right.
Oh yeah. To get to your point, Gaddy, the whole idea of cybersecurity, we're still waiting for somebody to make that movie that isn't absolutely ludicrous about the threats of cybersecurity, where the individual hacker can go in and tell Mick, hey, you're going to dump your savings account, or I'm going to turn off your pacemaker.
I think they did it in Homeland. I think they did it in Homeland, didn't they?
Because every movie that's come out that deals with that subject has been absolutely stupid. And it's easily written up. They're not entertaining. They're not believable.
Sorry. John, then Karen.
Well, I'm just struck. I mean, we're all talking about narratives, right? We're all talking about storytelling and using that as a means. And there was a chapter in here, where Dan Ward talked about pre-mortem, right? And I'll just say it. Chapter title: Darth Vader to Dark Helmet, right? But I think with the cyber side, I think the real challenge is I think at this point we're only really starting to get theory about cyber warfare, and I think the challenge of that is there's no good metaphor for cyber warfare. I mean, I can use metaphors to communicate what naval warfare is like, the difference between naval warfare and war on land. I can use metaphors that would make sense for air warfare. We talked about Billy Mitchell and what's different. The bomber always gets through, and we can have all that kind of discussion. But I think we're really challenged with cyber because we don't have anything that makes it concrete. It's hard to tell a story when you don't have a good metaphor to start with.
I am getting chills. Back in this large Sony data breach, everybody was talking about North Korea and the movie and making fun of Kim Jong-un and all of that stuff. And yet the people who went to work at Sony came to work in the morning with their computers dead, screens dark. And they said, do I steal the bank account? Is my Facebook safe? But I will go on this forever. I interrupt you on your topics. In cybersecurity, I can go on forever. Steve, then Karen.
Oh, just to further illustrate that the only metaphor I think we have that has a lot of value right now would be Ghost Fleet, and the book Ghost Fleet was really pretty good, but it treated things from a national defense perspective, and you've got to get below that level and touch the individual citizen to say, hey, your world is threatened. And it's not just that your computer at work is going to shut down. It's that your Tesla's not going to start. Your pacemaker is going to stop. Your phone won't work. All the little things that you take
in
for granted
cybersecurity, we call this FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And what we find is that while we get more budget, later on they don't believe us anymore. Cassandra again.
Yeah.
So let me stay with you for a second, Steve, before we move on to Karen. What do you think would work?
Say that again.
What do you think would work?
I still believe that to make that work, you've got to scare the individual person. If you could scare down to the lowest level, then they put the pressure up. If you get enough people that are afraid, they're going to pressure those politicians or policymakers to make.
And I will challenge you on that and say, if you keep scaring people, you don't really build programs over time that will allow you to reach real resiliency. But unfortunately, the only thing that works. Anyway, Karen.
Honestly, I was just making a quip about how bad these shows are. You'll see two people typing on the same keyboard. It's like they're really ludicrous. Two sets of hands on one keyboard. like how do we make programming look more intense, or working at a computer look more intense?
Okay, this is the lightning round. Mick.
I think cyber in particular is just one issue of how do you humanize these issues and how do you slow down the world for people, and that's really what it's about. We're moving at a bewildering rate of change, and we need to slow things down. And as Peter Singer says, sometimes you need to blend up vegetables for your kids' milkshakes. Fiction allows you to do that. Useful fiction, science fiction. make it accessible. You got to make it scary, but you've also got to make it enjoyable. You got to make it funny. All those you've got to engage all those human emotions to really cut through, I think, and that's what stories do. I mean, that's what we've done for tens of thousands of years. We've told stories, and that's what really appeals to human beings.
Not Lewis, I forget the name right now. It was, yes, Louis Mumford, back in the 1920s, was an urban planner for cities, and he worked on parking. And he said, when the day comes that everybody in the city has a right to parking, there will no longer be a city. We're talking about systems. So it's my favorite quote about the entire topic. There are so many complex systems woven together, but it is a human problem. And we have lost this war. We can talk about this forever. When it comes down to it, when you have such a strong asymmetry, where the attacker faces no repercussions whatsoever, when they can remain anonymous anytime they want, when your systems are inherently insecure, and I can keep going, when they can download your systems and test them in the lab and change a couple of bits and bypass you. And I can go into concentration of force and other aspects. When it comes down to it, it's a very defeatist industry. And just like the diet industry with hundreds of thousands of books out there and America being obese, we have also failed in our industry. The one difference is, and I'll end over with that, is that it's about civilization. It's about you, it's about me, it's about the person. I can build an entire world for a person using ads, so they'll see whatever I want, and I can take down the world, so to speak. But when it comes down to it, the reason I don't like FUD is because I've been through too many budget cycles. And I know that while FUD works, when it comes down to it, people will stop believing me. And more important than that, if I'm not good enough to be able to sell the case, if I'm not good enough to be able to have management support for an enterprise, then I have a real big problem, because FUD will not get me to the next stage. But we're almost out of time. I want to do one more round with everybody. And I wanted to just share something, whether from the book, it could be a book title, it could be a story, it could be about your chapter and why did you write it, or what do you want people to take away. Let's just go and get a feeling for this book. Steve, let's start with you.
So one of my two personal chapters dealt with the Planet of the Apes, going back to the original book, but I had a vision in my mind of what I was going to write, and as I started to write and started to research and pull things together, I ended up almost writing a love story to Rod Serling, who wrote the original script for the film, and it almost took over the chapter. You had a veteran of World War II who suffered from PTSD, who dealt with anti-Semitism as a kid, who grew up dealing with so many different things, and all that came out in that script. And whether you're talking about the struggling of where humanity is going, the threat of nuclear war, his childhood memories of being put in a different class than other people, and how all that bled into the book, into his first script. It was just absolutely fascinating, and it really got to me the human side of things that you don't necessarily see. In probably the 100 times I've seen that movie, I never knew all that until I started to write. And just, I mean, all the more respect for Rod Serling. I've always been a huge fan of Rod Serling, but I had no idea just how deep his personal story was woven into that script. And now I watch the movie and I see things that I've never seen before, whether, listening to Taylor's monologue or interaction between the different casts among the apes, what all that meant to him as a writer and a human being, and how it plays out in the film.
Let's go with Mick, because I love that Mick is going with my shenanigans.
I love your shenanigans. It's great to be here, Gutty.
Excuse me, I don't know that well yet.
Hey, there's the early Terminator films. Linda Hamilton used to talk about there's no fate than that we make, and I know newspapers don't sell with positive stories, but this book and books like it are about us imagining not just military stuff and strategy, but it's about imagining a better future. And that's really important. It's a really important role of stories. It's a really important role of science fiction. And I just hope that books like this one and beyond allow our people their creativity and to exercise their imagination to imagine that better future. I mean, why else would we serve?
John.
Yeah, you know,
And I'll just say, for a Canadian, you're very rude, sir. I just had to cut you off. Go ahead.
No. It's all good. There's so many things.
See? God, I would get this.
I would love to.
What's going on, people? Go ahead.
You know, I think a couple of things just to highlight real quickly is I really enjoy doing this. I think all of the chapter authors enjoyed doing this. When we did the chapter on the Mutara Nebula, you know, I was amazed as I pulled things out of the ether. I mean, Ray Bradbury did the 1956 screenplay for Moby Dick, and you can see how his influence is translated to the Wrath of Khan. And then you look at not only
sorry, I had to do this.
No. He tasks me. Oh, I'm a movie quote fiend, right? Frau Blucher. But anyway, you know, all the amazing things that were done that underpin a great story that allow you to envision the future and talk about that swirling naval battle. I mean, Steve and I have talked about that mono fight between not just Kirk and his crew versus Khan and his crew, but you know, it's almost like two knights jousting from the old days, or two single frigates in the battle of in like the War of 1812. It's just amazing. But the other chapter I did to bring it back to what you mentioned originally, Gotti, is I did another chapter on Khan and Khan. A study in never gets old. It's almost as good as Wheaton. But anyway, there's another illusion for you. But the Khan chapter is studying toxic leadership, and you know, something that we talk about all the time in military circuits.
Let's talk about something else. You know, I'm kidding.
No. But to watch the descent of someone, yes, he was a dictator who ruled over a huge portion of the earth in Khan, but to watch his descent from arguably a charismatic dictator to a man leading a small group on an isolated planet through its destruction to what we end up seeing in the final movie, to watch that descent of someone obviously with a questionable / broken moral compass to begin with, but to watch him descend because of the challenges he's faced with, I think there's something also to keep in the back of our minds as a cautionary tale. This stuff that we're talking about is not easy, and the circumstances that people are put in are not easy. But again, man's got a broken moral compass. So I'll leave it at that.
Interesting how this conversation throughout, right? We have kind of taken it to, let's talk about the human. Let's talk about the soldier. Let's talk about perspective. And it seems like in military strategy and history, and even in the way they teach at West Point, from what I hear, we've kind of shifted around. Lee's Lieutenants, I believe the book is called, is no longer taught at West Point because they picked an alternative that speaks also of the soldier's perspective and not just the strategy or the tactics. Looking at these changes, it's truly fascinating as I'm listening to even us talking right now. Max?
Well, I mean, this goes back to what we were saying about it has to be psychologically valid. And I think that's such an important point for any sort of speculative fiction or science fiction, is if you're trying to make a point about the real world, you've got to base it in real research, right? It's got to be based in reality. That's why On the Beach or The Day After or Threads was so absolutely terrifying, because it was based in reality. And I want to contrast it with another movie. I'm not going to say what it is. It was trying to make a point about global warming, but it was so such a gross, horrific.
I think that in 2021 we get the joke. In 2022 we won't.
No, I'm just going to say, if you're trying to save the planet, right? Don't have your characters literally running down a hallway being chased by the Ice Age.
Yeah, no, like this. I actually could not wrap my head around your claim that it was trying to make any point at all.
Well, that's the thing is, if you do that, then it's going to boomerang. It's going to blow up in your face, and then you become a point of ridicule, and then the very people you're trying to convince are going to join the opposition and say, well, that's ridiculous. So do your homework.
It was a metaphor.
I thought you were going to bring up Highlander too, but anyway.
Don't get me started on that one.
Max, one of your chapters, tell us something. Share with us something.
I mean, I would just say that we have to be, whenever you're confronted with a marginalized community that is willing to fight and die for your country, you're at a crossroads. Because I would contrast us with the British Empire. If the Brits had actually...
I'm going to cut you off right there and ask you a very tough question. Okay? Looking at history, looking at the Roman Empire and all the other states, looking at everything else, knowing it is going to be a problem. And doing something about it when all the different leverages are against you, how do we... I mean, I understand what you're saying, but I don't see how we can do anything different in the future.
We can do everything about it. We can do something about it because we already do. I would point to the American experiment, which has its starts and stops and bits and bats, but we are succeeding. The fact that we had a president who could have been a slave of our first president. I challenge any civilization on this planet to have made that much social progress that fast. We have done it. And in fact, in my country, every time you've had violent insurrection, it's not a violent insurrection for change. It's trying to turn back the change. The Civil War, the Confederacy, is proof that the American experiment has laid down the means to succeed.
Steve, it seems like you wanted to jump in there.
No, I just wish Max would talk more. I mean, just that observation is absolutely brilliant, and I've heard him say some similar things before, and it's so meaningful. You know, I saw something on Twitter today that I had to warn people, hey, just let it go. It was somebody who was baiting that the 9/11 attacks were, you know, generated for a completely different reason, and it was all racially motivated to support white people. And I'm like, come on now, just don't. Those are the kind of people that need to hear what Max just said. That the great experiment continues to be a great experiment, and the vehicles for social change have been constantly moving in a positive direction. Are they where we want them to be? Maybe not, but as long as we're still making progress, that's something to celebrate, not try to destroy.
So as I try to weave through this conversation, there are a few themes that kind of came together. And not just using science fiction as an example for our own world or how it affects us and how we can talk about things and explore them, but going from Mick and everything they shared, and Jon kind of brought it in with, you know, a little bit of this is how it works, this is history, right? Max swept us off our feet, literally, by bringing it down to this is what we're talking about. And Steve kind of framed it. You know, when we look at all this, it's really important. It's something we should look at and explore further. And when I try to look at the trends through this process that just happened to us, on the one hand, we had the science fiction we just discussed. On the other, we have how science fiction helps us explore the future, but not just as by definition, but rather thinking about what might happen for our own uses, right? And then we also brought it down to this is about people. This is about psychology, this is about connection, this is about engagement, this is about the person, not just the situation. See what I did there? But some of you probably did. But when I think about this, I still come back to the idea of Cassandra. Me, I'm not saying everybody. And the reason that I have that takeaway is because we keep seeing it happening. We warn people about things. They do not take us seriously, even if sometimes I can show you successes. For example, when Notre Dame burned down, they already had trees planted in Versailles where they could use them. They already had a plan for, like, the entire thing was planned so they can have resilience in place. But it happened to them before. I can show you other examples of the Cassandras that worked. But the one thing that I took away from my own kind of views is that as new technologies and new concepts are introduced, we have the historical examples where we try to build a new doctrine out of this is what happened in the air, therefore cyber will act that way. We have the science fiction that comes in. And then we start discovering more and more information until we come back to it. We started this discussion, though, with Max, where you mentioned you're at the War College right now. Right? And I think that framed it for me when we spoke before this show started about how people are stuck in the last war or something of the sort.
Yeah, no, what I talked about is sort of my fears for the future and our fears of losing the lessons of 20 years and going back to 1975, where you sort of run screaming into your comfort zone. And I think that that's very dangerous because there's a gravity pull in the United States towards the military-industrial complex. People making money off weapons that we don't need, and therefore having to adjust your strategy to having to sell weapons. And I think that is very dangerous because our enemies are outthinking us right now. There is an imagination gap. There is an asymmetric thinking gap in the West right now. Now, what's great about the West is we have the ability to change without the entire system collapsing. We're not a rigid autocracy, which is either perfection or death. So I'm actually very comforted by the fact that we can sit here and talk right now, and the Ministry of State Security is not going to take us away. So we have the ability to change, to think, to debate, like we do at the Modern War Institute or at the Scowcroft Center. And I think that that's our ace in the hole. And honestly, and I don't say this without any hyperbole, that's why in the long term, we'll win.
Boom. And we can end on that note. We are already over time because this has been so much fun. But as we're going, if you all bear with me for a second, I actually thought up an example. And if we can work really quickly through the example, I would appreciate it. You guys game? Okay. So I thought about Star Trek, the original series, because of Jon. And there was, I mentioned this before, probably at some point on the show, but there was first season, episode 14, The Balance of Terror, where, okay, we have somebody identifying it right there. Oh, what is Steve bringing us? What is that? Oh, hello.
Bird of prey.
Bird of prey. A bird of prey. That's Star Trek 6, The Undiscovered Country. But if you identify the, okay. So The Balance of Terror was based on this 1940s submarine warfare movie that I don't remember what it's called.
Enemy Below.
Thank you.
Yep, reading about this yesterday.
And the thing is, as they try to fight cloaked ships, and they use depth charges to try and blow up a portion of space, they try to run quiet, they try to do all those things, right? It kind of explores from submarine warfare what cloaked ships fighting might look like in the future. And I thought that example was absolutely beautiful for what we're talking about. And I would like to do a quick round and then kind of let Karen finish this off as she always brings us back. Nick, how about you?
You kind of lost me there, mate. I think I might defer to Steve on this one.
Fair enough.
I knew you were going to say that because I would have deferred to you too.
Maybe restate the question, Gotti.
I raised the point. It's vague, and I want you to talk about it, Max.
The question of what? You're being too Israeli.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's too obscure.
Oh man. Okay. Cloaked
this is nearly unanimous. I also don't know what you're talking about, but you said I could get last.
John is my back. John is my back. I can see you smiling there. So your cloaked ships.
What I'm getting out of this is you're exploring a metaphor for how do you deal with new technology. You're looking at a historical case about them struggling with fighting U-boats. In one of the key things about depth charges is they send out a concussive wave, so it's an area effect weapon that's often lost and all that. So how do you fight a cloaked ship? Well, an area effect kind of weapon makes a lot of sense, but this gets into the tactics, technology. You get a new tactic, new technology countered by a new technique. So that's what I get out of where you were going with that. I have no idea if that's.
I think I'll give it up at this stage because
wait, time. I'm going to go way deeper in Balance of Terror than you ever expected to go.
Go.
Okay, there's something so deep in there about inclusivity and exclusivity and racism in Balance of Terror, where that crewman tries to blame Spock and lump him in with the Romulans because he looks Vulcan. And that's really critical because, ladies and gentlemen, this is what we're going to be facing in our future competition with China. Everything China does, they're going to cry racism. Everything. They're going to cry anti-Chinese, racism. They tried to do it with COVID. It's total bullshit. And the reason we can beat them at their own game is embrace inclusivity, especially other Asians, including Chinese people. We are not in competition with the Chinese people. We are in competition with Xi and his little Winnie the Pooh clique. That's how you beat them, folks, because we love Vulcans. We love Romulans. We do not love the Romulan Senate.
That's it right there.
Well said, Max.
Yes.
There's also an
Okay.
interesting point in there, and I noticed you used there was his little Winnie the Pooh click. I think avoiding certain references as you complain about people is also really important. That's no racist trope I know.
Yeah.
To point at a stuffed bear.
And by the way, you see this because have you noticed as we talk about COVID, no one's mentioning the Taiwan miracle because they want Taiwan to go away. They're just as Chinese as the mainland Chinese. There's no difference in ethnicity. They're the Vulcans. And so we need to be very clear. And we did this in World War II about we're at war with a government, not with a people. We can do this again. People in mainland China, Asian people around the world, Chinese people, diaspora, we're with you. We're with you 100% because
So we went far here. I'm with you.
You're just as much a victim of Xi as anyone else. So we stand with you against the Politburo.
Max, when you talk, we stand with you because you really know how to grab us. But we kind of went far. So before we end, does anybody else want to say anything?
Gaddy, I have a question for you.
Oh,
so
man.
you brought up balance of terror. So I'm going to leave this with you. Did that bird of prey was it warp capable or wasn't it?
Was it what? Sorry, I cut you off.
Was it warp capable or not? That is, believe it or not, that is a debated issue to this day.
I think there is no way it couldn't have been.
Even though the Romulans had warp power 100 years before that, according to canon. Scotty refers to that as an impulse-only ship, which again gets back to the submarine technology.
Okay, let's build this then. Let's go into this then. Unless you really want to live with this. Let's do the argument. If the ship, going Babylon 5 for a second, if the ship was not warp capable, then in that case it had to be dropped there somehow, or these people were frozen for hundreds and thousands of years. So it's the speed of warp, it's the speed of plot, but still it couldn't have gotten there unless it was an error in the plot.
I love it.
No?
I just love this because this is the nerdy kind of debates that we come out of this book with.
Karen, we want to hear from you, and then we'll end.
I mean, this has been, just to sum things up rather than replying directly to this point, I think this really illustrates the value of talking about, storytelling outside of the immediate sphere of people who are already listening to these points, and using other media to do it is extremely valuable. And I'm frankly just waiting for puppies to tell me about asymmetrical warfare. That's what probably my main takeaway is, that I really want to watch that. I'll keep reminding you if you keep coming on our show, Max.
I brought this up before we went live, that I said, how do you reach the American people? Well, let's have puppies talking about it.
In Estonia, following
Star Trek brings us to a slightly wider group of people, but I think puppies are the future here.
Oh, yeah.
Unless they're said puppies. Ooh, I just went there.
Why? Why, Gotti?
Well, we went politics here, right? Said puppies is a different issue. But I'll say that we need to stop. This is fun. You are all amazing. And we can go on forever. The idea was to introduce the book, To Boldly Go, where you're writing about all these things, to talk about you, to talk about your ideas. And I just want to say thank you. Steve, you brought this together. Would you like to send us off home before I say goodbye to everybody?
I appreciate being here and the opportunity to work with such a wonderful group of people. I feel blessed. It's exciting, and one of the reasons why I have this today is because the people I work with understand what we're doing. And my boss showed up with this in a box yesterday and said, "Hey, man, I got this just for you." And it's those kind of things that that the love spreads. It's just a great experience.
Fair enough. Mick, Max, John, Steve, thank you. Karen, I know this show wasn't necessarily up your alley, but I think you enjoyed yourself as well.
Oh, always. And
this is Essence of Wonder. This was Essence of Wonder. We'll see you again soon. Our guests will stay with us for a post-action report. But we'll say goodbye at this stage. And to everybody watching us on Facebook, YouTube, and everywhere else. Thank you.
Thanks, Scotty. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gotti.
Yep.
Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having us.